Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Love, Lies and Betrayal. Let's move to the video. Anya adjusted the pleats of her sari, her hands trembling slightly as she heard the sound of laughter from the living room. Her sister, Mira, was married to Arjun, charming, kind, and effortlessly confident. He was everything a woman could admire, but he was also completely off limits. She had convinced herself over the years that her admiration for him was just a fleeting crush, a harmless fondness for the man who had become part of their family. But lately, something had shifted. The way Arjun's eyes lingered on her a second too long, the way he seemed to notice the smallest changes about her. It made her pulse quicken. Anya took a deep breath and stepped into the living room, where Mira and Arjun sat on the couch, laughing over an old family story. Arjun glanced up, and for a moment their eyes met. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze before he looked away. "Finally decided to join us?" he teased, his deep voice sending a shiver down her spine. Anya forced a smile and sat down, careful to keep a distance. "I was just finishing up some work," she said, avoiding his gaze. Mira grinned. "You work too much, Anya. You should take a break sometimes. Maybe let Arjun take you out for coffee. He always finds the best places." Anya's heart skipped a beat. Did Mira not realize the weight of her words? Or was she just reading too much into things? Arjun chuckled. "Anytime Anya wants, I'd be happy to." His words were casual, but there was something in his tone. A quiet challenge, a subtle invitation. Anya swallowed hard. This was dangerous territory, and she knew it. But deep down, she also knew something else. She wasn't sure she wanted to walk away. Anya spent the rest of the evening avoiding Arjun's gaze, but no matter how hard she tried, she could feel his presence like a magnet pulling her in. Every time he laughed, every time he spoke, she was acutely aware of him, of the way his voice sent shivers down her spine, of the warmth in his gaze when their eyes met. By the time dinner was over, she excused herself, needing a moment to breathe. She walked out onto the balcony, letting the cool night air calm her racing heart. The city lights stretched before her, twinkling like stars, but she could focus on only one thing, the way her body reacted to Arjun's nearness. "You okay?" She startled at the sound of his voice. Turning, she found Arjun leaning against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Yeah, just needed some air," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. He stepped closer, and her breath hitched. "You seemed quiet tonight," he observed. "Everything all right?" Anya forced a small smile. "Of course. Just tired." Arjun didn't look convinced. He moved closer, the warmth of his body dangerously close to hers. "You know," he said softly, "you don't have to pretend with me." Her heart pounded. Did he know? Did he sense the forbidden thoughts that had been consuming her? "Arjun," she started, but he interrupted her, his voice just above a whisper. "Sometimes, I think you and we understand each other in ways no one else does." She swallowed hard, her mind screaming at her to walk away, to end this before it was too late. But her body betrayed her. Her feet stayed planted, her breath shallow as she met his gaze, one full of unspoken words, of something dangerous, yet intoxicating. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, she whispered, "That's what scares me." A tense silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of everything they weren't saying. Arjun exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Anya, we shouldn't—" "I know," she breathed. But neither of them moved away. And in that moment, Anya knew. This was only the beginning. Aanya barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the way Arjun had looked at her, the hesitation, the unspoken longing. She should have felt guilt clawing at her, but all she felt was restless anticipation. The next morning, she forced herself to act normal. Mira was bustling around the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Arjun sat at the dining table, casually scrolling through his phone. When Anya walked in, his eyes flicked up to hers for just a second, brief but enough to send a jolt through her body. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice steady. Mira grinned. "Finally awake? I was just telling Arjun we should take you out today. You've been locked in your room with work too much." Anya hesitated. "Oh, that's not necessary." "But I insist," Mira interrupted. "Actually, I have to meet a friend later, but Arjun can take you." "Right, Arjun?" Anya's stomach flipped. Was fate playing with her? Arjun smirked slightly, sipping his coffee. Of course, if Anya doesn't mind. She did mind, she should mind, but instead she nodded. Okay. An hour later they were in his car, the tension between them thick and unspoken. Arjun drove in silence at first, fingers tapping against the steering wheel. Finally he spoke. "Anya. About last night." She looked at him, heart pounding. "We don't have to talk about it." He exhaled sharply. "Maybe we should." "What is there to say?" she whispered. He pulled the car over on a quiet street, turning to face her. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "Tell me to walk away, and I will." Anya opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She should say it, should end this before it spiraled out of control. But she didn't. Instead, she reached for his hand, fingers trembling as they brushed against his. Arjun sucked in a breath, gripping the steering wheel like he was holding himself back. "Anya." "I don't know how to stop," she admitted. A long silence stretched between them before he whispered, "Neither do I." And with that, the line they had been dancing around shattered completely. The air inside the car felt charged, thick with something neither of them dared to name. Anya's fingers still rested lightly against Arjun's, and though neither of them moved, the moment felt dangerously intimate. A horn blared behind them, shattering the tension. Arjun exhaled sharply, pulling his hand away as he started the car again. Anya turned to the window, pressing her fingers against her lap to stop them from trembling. This was a mistake, and yet neither of them had stopped it. Arjun took her to a quiet cafe tucked away in a less crowded part of the city. It was small, intimate, the kind of place that felt like a secret. As they settled into their seats, he leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "We should be careful," he said finally. Anya stirred her coffee slowly, not looking at him. "I know." "But you don't want to be, do you?" She glanced up at him then, her heart skipping a beat at the way he looked at her, like he was trying to fight something but failing miserably. "Do you?" she asked softly. Arjun ran a hand through his hair, a humorless chuckle escaping his lips. "I wish I did." Anya swallowed hard. "This is wrong," she murmured. "Then why does it feel inevitable?" he countered. She had no answer for that. The next few minutes passed in silence, each of them lost in their own turmoil, but then Arjun did something reckless, something irreversible. He reached across the table and took her hand, fingers warm against hers. Anya should have pulled away. She should have walked out. Instead, she let herself hold on. A second too long, a second too much. And just like that, the first mistake had been made. Anya knew she should have let go. The moment Arjun's fingers curled around hers, she felt the shift, the point of no return. Yet she held on, just for a second longer than she should have. When the waiter approached, Arjun pulled his hand away, clearing his throat. The moment was gone, but the tension wasn't. The drive home was quiet. Anya stared out the window, her thoughts a tangled mess. She had always admired Arjun, always felt something unspoken between them. But today was different. Today they had acknowledged it. By the time they reached home, Anya expected the weight of guilt to crush her. But it didn't. Instead, all she could think about was how much she wanted to feel his touch again. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the moonlit street below, when a soft knock on her door made her freeze. Her heart pounded. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Arjun stood there, his expression unreadable, his breathing uneven. "Anya," he whispered, his voice rough, almost desperate. She should have closed the door. She should have told him to leave. But instead, she stepped back, silently inviting him in. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face, but then he entered, shutting the door behind him. For a long moment, they just stood there, the only sound between them the rhythm of their breathing. "This is dangerous," she whispered. "I know." His voice was barely audible. He reached for her then, his fingers brushing against her wrist. It was the lightest of touches, yet it set her entire body on fire. Aanya closed her eyes. She had been fighting this for too long. When she opened them, she saw the same war in Arjun's gaze, the same hunger, the same torment, and then, finally, he gave in. He cupped her face, his thumb grazing her cheek as he leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. Anya's lips parted, her pulse racing as she felt the space between them disappear. And then, just as his lips were about to touch hers, a sound echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. Anya's eyes widened in panic, and Arjun pulled away instantly, stepping back as if burned. The moment shattered. He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "We can't do this." Aanya swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. "I know." But as Arjun slipped out of her room, one thing became painfully clear. Neither of them believed that for a second. Aanya barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart still pounding from the near kiss, from the way Arjun had touched her like he was fighting against himself. Morning came too soon. As she stepped out of her room, she felt the weight of last night pressing on her. She told herself she'd avoid Arjun today, that she'd pretend nothing had happened. But fate had other plans. She found him alone in the kitchen, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his hands. His back was to her, but the moment she stepped in, he stiffened. He knew she was there. Aanya hesitated. She could turn around, walk away before he even looked at her. But then, as if sensing her thoughts, Arjun turned. Their eyes met. And just like that, everything from last night came rushing back. "Morning," he said, his voice low. Aanya swallowed. "Morning." An awkward silence stretched between them. She could still feel the ghost of his touch, the warmth of his hand on her face, the way their breaths had mingled in the dark. "We need to talk," he finally said. She forced herself to nod. "I know." Arjun set his cup down, his jaw tense. Whatever this is, it has to stop." Her heart twisted. "You think I don't know that?" His eyes darkened. "Then why does it feel impossible?" She exhaled shakily. "Because it is." Arjun ran a hand through his hair, frustration written all over his face. "Aanya, Mira." "I know," she whispered, pain slicing through her chest. "She's my sister." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The reality of what they were doing loomed over them like a storm waiting to break. Arjun stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me to stay away from you, and I will." Aanya opened her mouth. The words were there. "Stay away. We can't. This is wrong." But they never came. Instead, her silence spoke for her. Arjun's breathing grew heavier, his restraint visibly cracking. His fingers twitched at his sides like he was fighting the urge to touch her. Then, just as he took another step forward, "Aanya!" Mira's voice rang from the hallway. Aanya jumped back and Arjun turned away, gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Seconds later, Mira walked in, smiling, completely unaware of the fire raging between them. "There you are! I was looking for you," Mira said cheerfully, walking straight to the fridge. "Arjun, we're going out for dinner tonight, okay?" Arjun cleared his throat, his voice perfectly steady. "Yeah, sure." Anya's nails dug into her palms. How was he so good at pretending? Mira turned to her. "And you're coming too. No excuses." Aanya forced a smile. "Of course." She knew she had no choice. But as she risked one last glance at Arjun, she realized something terrifying. No matter how many excuses they made, no matter how much they fought it, this wasn't going away. The restaurant was warm and lively, filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Anya sat across from Mira and Arjun, trying to focus on the food, on her sister's cheerful chatter, on anything but the man sitting next to her. But it was impossible. Every time Arjun shifted, every time his arm brushed against hers, a jolt of heat ran through her veins. He was too close. His scent, warm, masculine, familiar, wrapped around her, making it hard to breathe. Anya tried to push the thoughts away, but then Mira leaned into Arjun's side, resting her head on his shoulder with an affectionate sigh. "My husband is the best," she teased, smiling up at him. "I don't know what I'd do without him." Anya's stomach twisted. She forced a smile, ignoring the sudden tightness in her chest. This was wrong. She had no right to feel like this. Arjun stiffened slightly but recovered quickly, pressing a soft kiss to Mira's forehead. He was playing the perfect husband, but when his eyes flicked to Anya's, there was something else there. A silent plea. A warning. Anya dropped her gaze to her plate. Mira continued chatting, oblivious to the storm brewing between them. "Anya, you really should start dating again. Maybe Arjun can set you up with one of his friends." Anya's heart pounded. "I'm not really looking for anything serious," she murmured. "Maybe you should," Arjun said suddenly, his voice low and unreadable. Anya glanced at him, her breath catching at the intensity in his gaze. Was he trying to push her away? Or was he testing her? Mira laughed. "Well, if you change your mind, let me know. I'd love to play matchmaker." The conversation moved on, but Anya barely heard it. All she could feel was the way Arjun's knee pressed against hers under the table, and how neither of them moved away. Later that night, back at home, Anya stood by her bedroom window, staring at the moonlit sky. Her heart was heavy, her mind restless. A soft knock at the door made her freeze. She knew who it was before she even turned. Slowly, she walked to the door and opened it. Arjun stood there, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he said, "Tell me to leave, Anya." She opened her mouth, but just like before, no words came. And this time, neither of them stopped what happened next. Anya knew she was in too deep. The stolen glances, the lingering touches, every moment with Arjun felt like stepping closer to the edge of a cliff. She had convinced herself that she could control it, that she could bury her feelings deep enough to protect her sister, Mira. But some things couldn't be buried forever. The rain poured heavily that evening, drumming against the windows of the Malhotra house. Mira had left earlier for a last-minute business trip, and Anya found herself alone with Arjun. It wasn't unusual. Over the past few months, they had shared quiet moments like this. But tonight, something felt different. Anya sat on the living room couch, pretending to read a book, but her eyes flickered toward Arjun, who was pacing near the fireplace. His jaw was tense, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You seem restless," she said softly. He stopped, looking at her for a long moment before sighing. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Anya's heart skipped a beat. "Do what?" Arjun ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Pretend, act like nothing is happening, like I don't think about you every second of the day." Her breath caught. "Arjun?" "I know it's wrong," he cut in, stepping closer. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I do. And I can't lie to myself anymore." Anya shook her head, her fingers tightening around the book in her lap. "We can't." "We already have," he whispered. The space between them felt charged, heavy with everything they had left unsaid. The storm outside mirrored the one raging inside her. She knew she should push him away, remind him of Mira, of the lines they couldn't cross. But when Arjun reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, she didn't move away. Instead, she let herself drown. The book slipped from her hands as Arjun cupped her face, his thumb tracing her cheek. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he murmured. Anya swallowed hard, but the words wouldn't come, because lying to him, lying to herself, was impossible. And then, he kissed her. It wasn't soft or hesitant. It was desperate, full of all the moments they had ignored, all the feelings they had refused to name. Aanya clung to him, her body betraying her mind, her heart making the choice her conscience couldn't. The sound of thunder roared outside, masking the sound of her own heartbeat as she let herself fall. But deep down, she knew. This was the moment everything changed. And there would be no going back. Anya's heart pounded as she stepped away from Arjun, her breath still uneven from the kiss. The knock at the door came again, louder this time. "Aanya?" Mira's voice was closer now, just on the other side. Arjun ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of panic and regret. Aanya quickly smoothed her dress, forcing herself to breathe. She had to act normal. She had to pretend nothing had just happened, nothing that could shatter everything. With one last look at Arjun, she turned and opened the door. Mira stood there, frowning. "Why did it take you so long to open?" she asked, eyes scanning the room. Aanya swallowed hard. I was just changing." Her voice was steadier than she expected, but her hands trembled slightly. Mira's gaze flickered behind her. For a terrifying second, Aanya thought she had seen Arjun, but when she turned, he was gone. The window was slightly open, the only sign of his escape. Mira sighed, oblivious. "Come downstairs, we're watching a movie." Aanya forced a smile. "Yeah, I'll be there in a minute." As soon as Mira left, Aanya shut the door and leaned against it, exhaling shakily. What had she done? The next day, Aanya avoided Arjun. She needed space, needed to think, but no matter how hard she tried to focus on anything else, she could still feel his lips on hers, the way he had held her like he never wanted to let go. That night she stayed in her room, curled up in bed, when a message flashed on her phone. "Arjun, we need to talk." Her fingers hovered over the screen. She should ignore him. She should pretend last night never happened. But her heart had other plans. "Aanya, not now." A pause. Then another message. "Arjun, please." Aanya closed her eyes. She knew this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Aanya knew she should have ignored Arjun's message. She should have silenced her phone, turned away, and pretended that last night had been a mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She hesitated for a long time before finally typing back. "Aanya, meet me in the garden, 10 minutes." Her hands shook as she sent the message. She told herself this was just to end things, to make it clear that whatever had happened between them could never happen again. But as she slipped out of the house into the cool night air, she knew she was lying to herself. Arjun was already there, leaning against a tree, his expression tense. The moment he saw her, he straightened. Neither of them spoke at first. The weight of what they had done, what they were risking, hung heavy between them. Aanya crossed her arms, trying to keep her voice firm. "This has to stop." Arjun's jaw clenched. "I know," she swallowed. "Then why did you ask me to meet you?" He let out a slow breath, stepping closer. "Because I needed to see you." Her heart ached at the raw honesty in his voice. She had spent the whole day trying to suppress the memory of his touch, of his lips against hers. But standing here, under the stars, with him so close, she knew she had already lost this battle. "Aanya," he murmured, his fingers barely grazing hers. "Tell me you don't feel this." She should have lied. She should have walked away. Instead, she whispered, "I feel everything." Arjun inhaled sharply, his restraint slipping. "Then how do we stop?" Anya's eyes burned. "We don't have a choice." He reached up, his fingers brushing against her cheek, tracing the curve of her jaw. "We always have a choice." Her breath hitched. "No, we don't. Mira—" Arjun flinched at her name, like it was the one thing keeping him tethered to reality. "I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to stop wanting you." Aanya squeezed her eyes shut. "We have to try." His fingers lingered for a moment before he let them fall away. "Then tell me, this is the last time we meet like this." She opened her mouth. The words were there, but she couldn't say them, because deep down she knew this wasn't the end. It was only a matter of time before the truth destroyed them both. Aanya barely made it through the next few days. She told herself she had done the right thing by walking away from Arjun that night in the garden, that the distance between them was necessary. But every time she saw him, every time their eyes met across the room, she felt the ache of something unfinished. Arjun, however, played his role perfectly. Around Mira, he was the devoted husband, attentive and composed. Around Aanya, he was distant, almost cold. It should have made things easier. It didn't, because even in his silence, she could feel him. One evening, Mira planned a dinner at home with a few friends. Aanya had no excuse to avoid it, so she sat through the meal, forcing herself to smile, pretending to be unaffected by Arjun's presence across the table. But then it happened. Aanya reached for a glass of water at the same time as Arjun. Their fingers brushed, just for a second, and that was all it took. The air shifted. Aanya froze, her pulse hammering, but she didn't pull away. Neither did he. His touch lingered, his fingertips barely grazing hers before he finally withdrew, clenching his hand into a fist under the table. Aanya looked up. His eyes met hers, dark and intense, and in that moment, she knew. This wasn't over. Later that night, long after the guests had left and Mira had gone to bed, Aanya found herself standing in the hallway outside Arjun's study. She knew she shouldn't be here. She should go back to her room, lock the door, and never look back. But before she could stop herself, she knocked. The door opened almost instantly. Arjun stood there, his expression unreadable, his breath uneven. It was as if he had been waiting for her. Neither of them spoke. Aanya stepped inside. The door clicked shut. And in that moment, the last of their restraint shattered. Arjun pulled her against him, his lips crashing onto hers with all the passion, the desperation, the longing they had spent weeks trying to suppress. Aanya gasped against his mouth, her hands fisting into his shirt as he backed her against the desk. The world outside didn't exist anymore. All that mattered was this: him, them, the inevitable. Anya's back hit the desk, her breath stolen as Arjun's lips claimed hers with a hunger that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer, and she melted into him, her fingers threading through his hair. This was madness. This was inevitable. Arjun deepened the kiss, his body pressing against hers as if he couldn't bear even an inch of space between them. Aanya gasped when his lips trailed down her jaw, leaving fire in their wake. "We shouldn't," she whispered, her voice shaky, but her hands betrayed her, clutching at him desperately. Arjun exhaled against her skin. "I know." But neither of them moved away. The study was dimly lit, the night outside silent, as if the universe itself had paused to watch their downfall. Aanya felt his heartbeat against hers, fast and unsteady, mirroring her own. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Anya's eyes flew open in panic. Arjun tensed. They barely had a second to react before a voice shattered the moment. "Arjun?" "Mira." Anya's blood ran cold. Arjun jerked away, his breathing ragged. Aanya scrambled off the desk, smoothing her dress, trying to quiet the racing of her heart. The door handle turned. Arjun was faster. He strode forward and cracked the door open just enough to block Aanya from view. Mira stood there, sleer. She frowned. "Why are you still?" Her hair slightly messy. Wake Arjun cleared his throat, his voice carefully steady. "Just finishing up some work." Mira's gaze flickered past him, and for a terrifying moment, Aanya thought she would step inside. Then Mira sighed. "Come to bed soon, okay?" Arjun nodded. "I will." Mira gave him a small smile before turning and disappearing down the hallway. Aanya let out a shaky breath. Arjun closed the door, pressing his forehead against it for a second before turning to face her. "This has to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Anya wrapped her arms around herself, her chest tight. "Do you really believe that?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with torment. "No." Silence stretched between them. They had just barely escaped, but for how much longer? Anya barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Arjun's hands on her, his lips, his breath. And then, Mira's voice just on the other side of the door. They had almost been caught. That should have been enough to stop them. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, all she could think about was the way Arjun had looked at her before she left his study. The way he had said no when she asked if he really wanted to stop. She was losing control. They both were. And something told her that this wasn't just going to go away. The next morning, Anya forced herself to act normal. She sat at the breakfast table with Mira and Arjun, sipping her tea as if she hadn't spent the night drowning in guilt and desire. Mira was scrolling through her phone, oblivious as usual. "Oh, my parents want us to visit them next weekend," she said cheerfully. "It's been so long since we all got together." Anya nearly choked on her tea. Their parents. That meant hers and Mira's, but also Arjun's parents. The weight of reality crashed down on her. She wasn't just betraying her sister, she was betraying an entire family. Arjun's grip tightened around his coffee mug. "That's a good idea," he said, his voice too calm, too forced. Anya could feel his tension from across the table. Mira turned to her. "You'll come too, right?" Anya hesitated. Of course she will," Arjun cut in, his eyes locking onto hers for a fraction of a second. A silent warning. Mira beamed. "Perfect. It'll be nice to spend time together. We don't do that enough." Anya's stomach twisted. Mira had no idea how much time she and Arjun were already spending together. That evening, Anya stepped out onto the balcony, hoping the cool air would clear her mind. The city lights flickered in the distance, a distraction she desperately needed, but she wasn't alone for long. She heard the sliding door behind her and knew before turning who it was. Arjun. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside her, staring out at the city. Then, quietly, he said, "We have to stop before we destroy everything." Anya closed her eyes. "I know." But knowing it and doing it were two different things. He turned to face her, his voice strained. "Then why does it feel impossible?" Anya looked up at him, her heart breaking. "Because it is." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without thinking, Arjun reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. It was the smallest touch. But it was enough. They weren't done. Not yet. And deep down, they both knew it. Anya knew they were walking on the edge of disaster. Every glance, every stolen moment, every brush of Arjun's fingers against hers was another step toward something they could never undo. And yet, she couldn't stop. Neither could he. The trip to visit their parents loomed closer, and Anya felt trapped between duty and desire. The house would be filled with family, with memories, with reminders of everything she was supposed to be. Mira's sister, Arjun's sister-in-law. Not his secret, not his sin. The night before they were set to leave, Anya found herself in the kitchen late at night, restless, unable to sleep. She reached for a glass of water, only to freeze when she heard footsteps behind her. She knew who it was before she turned. Arjun. His eyes were dark with something she didn't dare name. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head. "You?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth. Close enough that if she reached out, no. She backed up against the counter, gripping the edge as if it could ground her. "Arjun, we can't—" "I know," he murmured. But he didn't move away. Silence stretched between them. Then, "I'm losing my mind," he admitted, his voice raw. "Every second, every breath, I'm fighting this, fighting you." Anya's throat tightened. "Then maybe we should stop being around each other." His eyes flashed. "Is that what you want?" She should have said yes. She should have walked away, but instead she whispered, "I don't know anymore." Arjun exhaled harshly, his restraint slipping. "Aanya!" A sudden noise from the hallway made them both jerk back. Anya's pulse raced as Mira's sleepy voice called out, "Arjun!" His hands clenched at his sides. "Go!" he whispered urgently. Anya hesitated for a second too long. Then, with one last, longing look, she slipped away into the darkness, her heart pounding. She didn't know how much longer they could keep this secret, but she knew one thing for certain: they were running out of time. Aanya barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Arjun's hands on her, his lips, his breath, and then Mira's voice, just on the other side of the door. They had almost been caught. That should have been enough to stop them. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, all she could think about was the way Arjun had looked at her before she left his study. The way he had said no when she asked if he really wanted to stop. She was losing control. They both were. And something told her that this wasn't just going to go away. The next morning, Anya forced herself to act normal. She sat at the breakfast table with Mira and Arjun, sipping her tea as if she hadn't spent the night drowning in guilt and desire. Mira was scrolling through her phone, oblivious as usual. "Oh, my parents want us to visit them next weekend," she said cheerfully. "It's been so long since we all got together." Anya nearly choked on her tea. Their parents, that meant hers and Mira's, but also Arjun's parents. The weight of reality crashed down on her. She wasn't just betraying her sister, she was betraying an entire family. Arjun's grip tightened around his coffee mug. "That's a good idea," he said, his voice too calm, too forced. Anya could feel his tension from across the table. Mira turned to her. "You'll come too, right?" Anya hesitated. Of course she will," Arjun cut in, his eyes locking onto hers for a fraction of a second. A silent warning. Mira beamed. "Perfect. It'll be nice to spend time together. We don't do that enough." Anya's stomach twisted. Mira had no idea how much time she and Arjun were already spending together. That evening, Anya stepped out onto the balcony, hoping the cool air would clear her mind. The city lights flickered in the distance, a distraction she desperately needed. But she wasn't alone for long. She heard the sliding door behind her and knew before turning who it was: Arjun. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside her, staring out at the city. Then quietly, he said, "We have to stop before we destroy everything." Anya closed her eyes. "I know." But knowing it and doing it were two different things. He turned to face her, his voice strained. "Then why does it feel impossible?" Anya looked up at him, her heart breaking. "Because it is." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without thinking, Arjun reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. It was the smallest touch. But it was enough. They weren't done. Not yet. And deep down, they both knew it. Anya knew they were walking on the edge of disaster. Every glance, every stolen moment, every brush of Arjun's fingers against hers was another step toward something they could never undo. And yet, she couldn't stop. Neither could he. The trip to visit their parents loomed closer, and Anya felt trapped between duty and desire. The house would be filled with family, with memories, with reminders of everything she was supposed to be. Mira's sister, Arjun's sister-in-law. Not his secret, not his sin. The night before they were set to leave, Anya found herself in the kitchen late at night, restless, unable to sleep. She reached for a glass of water, only to freeze when she heard footsteps behind her. She knew who it was before she turned. Arjun. His eyes were dark with something she didn't dare name. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head. "You?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth. Close enough that if she reached out, no. She backed up against the counter, gripping the edge as if it could ground her. "Arjun, we can't." "I know." he murmured. But he didn't move away. Silence stretched between them. Then, "I'm losing my mind," he admitted, his voice raw. "Every second, every breath, I'm fighting this, fighting you." Anya's throat tightened. "Then maybe we should stop being around each other." His eyes flashed. "Is that what you want?" She should have said yes. She should have walked away. But instead, she whispered, "I don't know anymore." Arjun exhaled harshly, his restraint slipping. "Anya!" A sudden noise from the hallway made them both jerk back. Anya's pulse raced as Mira's sleepy voice called out, "Arjun?" His hands clenched at his sides. "Go," he whispered urgently. Anya hesitated for a second too long. Then, with one last, longing look, she slipped away into the darkness, her heart pounding. She didn't know how much longer they could keep this secret, but she knew one thing for certain: they were running out of time. The car ride to their parents' house was suffocating. Mira sat in the front passenger seat, talking animatedly about their childhood memories, while Arjun focused on the road. Every now and then he nodded, offering a small smile in response to his wife's stories. To anyone else, they looked like the perfect couple, comfortable, happy, deeply in love. But in the back seat, Anya sat rigid, staring out the window, her heart pounding. The air between her and Arjun was thick with tension, an unspoken weight pressing down on them both. She wanted to believe that this trip back home would help her reset, that being surrounded by family would remind her of who she was supposed to be. But then why did she feel like she was about to shatter? Arjun's eyes flickered toward her in the rearview mirror, just for a second, but it was enough. The look in his gaze sent a shiver through her body, a mixture of longing, regret, and something even deeper: guilt, because they both knew what they had done. And no matter how much they tried to ignore it, pretend it never happened, the truth clung to them like a second skin. They had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. Their parents welcomed them with open arms, the warmth of home wrapping around them like a soft embrace. The house smelled of cardamom and warm spices, the way it always had when they were kids. Mira slipped into daughter mode effortlessly, laughing with their mother, setting the table, pulling Anya along to help. For a while, Anya let herself believe she could be normal again. She clung to the familiarity, the teasing, the old stories, the inside jokes. She laughed at her father's exaggerated tales, let her mother fuss over her, and watched as Mira and Arjun seamlessly blended into the picture-perfect couple everyone believed them to be. But no matter how much she tried to push it away, Anya could feel the heat of Arjun's presence, his silent gaze catching her in stolen moments, a brush of his hand when he passed her the plate at dinner, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. She hated herself for noticing, for wanting more. A night of restlessness. That night, Anya tossed and turned in the small guest room, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, everyone else deep in sleep. But sleep refused to come for her. She felt suffocated by the weight of her secrets, by the ache in her chest, by the reality she had created for herself. Needing air, she pushed the covers off and slipped out of bed. She moved through the dark house, her bare feet silent against the cold floor. Without thinking, she stepped outside into the backyard, the cool night air hitting her skin like a much-needed slap. The stars glittered above, indifferent to the mess she had made of her life. She wrapped her arms around herself, exhaling shakily. "Breathe," she whispered to herself. "Just breathe." But then, a familiar presence made her breath catch in her throat. Anya turned. Arjun. He stood there, just a few feet away, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the porch light. His expression was unreadable, his body tense, as if he had been drawn to her against his will. Her heart pounded. "What are you doing here?" He hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. "I couldn't sleep." She swallowed. "Neither could I." Silence settled between them, heavy with everything they wanted to say but couldn't. Anya clenched her fists. "Arjun, we can't keep—" "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But tell me." His dark eyes locked onto hers, desperate, searching. "Does it even matter anymore?" We can't undo what's already been done. Her breath hitched. She wanted to fight it, to tell him that it did matter, that they had to stop before it was too late. But wasn't it already too late? Arjun took another step closer, and suddenly he was right there, his warmth, his scent, his everything wrapping around her like an invisible force. "Tell me you don't feel this," he murmured, his voice strained. "Tell me you don't think about me every second of the day." Aanya closed her eyes, shaking her head, trying to will away the truth. "This is wrong." His fingers grazed her wrist, a barely there touch, but it sent a wildfire through her veins. "Then why does it feel so right?" And that was it. That was all it took. The moment his lips touched hers, Aanya felt herself crumble. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a breaking, a surrender, a confession of everything they had tried to deny. She clutched onto his shirt as his hands slid into her hair, pulling her closer, as if he could fuse her into him, as if he never wanted to let go. She didn't know how long they stood there, lost in each other, lost in a love that was never meant to be. But then, a sharp, shattered whisper cut through the night. "Aanya?" Everything froze. Anya's entire body stiffened. Her heart stopped. She turned, dread pooling in her stomach. Mira stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief and devastation. Her hand covered her mouth, as if trying to hold in a scream, as if the sight before her was too unbearable to witness. Anya's throat went dry. "Mira!" But there were no words that could fix this. No way to erase what had just happened. The moment shattered like glass. And Aanya knew. Their secret was out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence was suffocating. Mira's wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto Aanya and Arjun, disbelief etched onto her face. The betrayal hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Aanya opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. What could she possibly say? That she didn't mean for this to happen? That she never wanted to hurt her? That she loved her despite this unforgivable mistake? None of it would matter, because the damage was already done. Mira's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the night like a blade. "My own sister?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and Aanya felt the weight of her guilt crush her chest. "Mira!" Arjun took a step forward, but Mira flinched, her entire body trembling. "Don't!" Her voice hardened. "Don't come near me." Her gaze flickered between the two of them, and Aanya could see the moment her heart shattered. The moment she realized the two people she loved the most had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Tears streamed down Mira's face as she let out a broken laugh. "I trusted you, both of you." Anya's vision blurred with tears. "Mira, please, But Mira shook her head, stepping back. "Number, I don't want to hear it." Her voice was laced with pain, with finality. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Arjun clenched his fists, his face twisted with guilt. "Mira, it wasn't supposed to—" "Stop!" She held up her hand, her entire body shaking. "I don't want to hear your excuses." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Mira let out a trembling breath, her shoulders rising and falling as she steadied herself. "You made your choice, Arjun." Her voice wavered. "And you—" She turned to Aanya, her expression a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "You were my sister." Aanya felt her chest tighten, whir, past tense. Mira wiped at her tears and took a shaky step back. "I can't look at either of you right now." She turned and walked back inside, the door slamming behind her. Aanya flinched at the sound, as if it were the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. She turned to Arjun, her heart breaking all over again. "What have we done?" Arjun ran a hand down his face, exhaling shakily. "The one thing we swore we wouldn't." They stood there in the cold, the weight of their choices suffocating them both. For months they had lived in a dream, convincing themselves that their love was something they could keep hidden. But reality had finally caught up to them, and the cost of their forbidden love was too great. Mira was gone, their secret was out, and now, nothing would ever be the same again. Epilogue. Some wounds never heal. Anya never returned to the Malhotra house. She left the next morning before Mira could say another word, before she could watch the pieces of their relationship fall apart even further. Mira didn't call. Anya didn't expect her to. Some betrayals were too deep to fix. Arjun tried to reach out, but Anya knew better. Their love had already destroyed too much, and she couldn't bear to destroy anything more. So she walked away. She walked away from him. She walked away from Mira. And she walked away from the life she had ruined. Because in the end, love wasn't always enough. Sometimes love was the very thing that tore everything apart. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Don't forget to click the notification bell icon to stay notified.